Hello, Orbit fanatics, and welcome to another episode of 0K, the podcast where we go over the highlights from the Urbit extended universe and talk to some of the people that are building Urbit, the decentralized operating system for the next 500 years. Today, you're in for a very special treat. I have an interview with the inimitable hastuc-dibtux about Hoon Native UI. What is that? Who is he? Hoon Native UI means that you can now define the entire UI of an application from within your Urbit, which means that you won't spend all this time mucking around in old world technologies like JavaScript, HTML, CSS, things like this. It also means that you, as the user, can customize what your Urbit looks and feels like. The dream is coming true. hastuc-dibtux has been working on Urbit for a little while now. He's one of our best guys, I'd say. And he's a man shrouded in mystery. So you'll hear a little bit more about the Urbit UI project. You'll hear a little bit about his villainous origin story. And I think it's going to be a good time. So here you go. hastuc-dibtux.
You know, you don't know about Urbit. You find out about Urbit. You get into Urbit.
Yeah.
Give me the story.
My personal story.
Your
My
journey,
personal
your
story.
Urbit journey.
Well, I don't know, dude. I kind of grew up online in just random disparate corners of the internet. And
Such as if you can say them on camera.
if I can say them on camera. No, which I can't, because that would be too much identifying information.
Okay,
This is for OPSEC purposes.
Bodybuilding.com comment section.
MISC? Yeah. No, I was never a MISC.
Okay.
You can kind of tell that from the
I was
physique.
gonna say. All right, so you're on the internet.
Yeah, I was just on the internet. I was hanging out in IRC chat rooms, which is somewhat anachronistic for a Zoomer.
Yeah.
It's
who hangs out there now? Who's
what? No one's there now.
He's just alone.
It's just it's just alone in IRC. It's screaming into an ASCII void. And somebody jumps in the channel and it's hey, I actually don't know who it was, because I feel I probably would have met them at some point.
Yeah.
Or it was probably some still existing member of the Urbit community, because nobody really quits Urbit. They just
True.
They just take a break.
Exactly.
Once you're here for life.
Exactly, a hiatus.
So
someone jumps in.
Jumps in this IRC channel, and they're oh, it's this thing called Urbit, and this was 2015, dude. I'm 15 years old. I'm still a little bit brain dead. I appear to be aging slower than normal, so I was mentally 12 basically, and so I was oh, this looks cool, and I could program a little bit, I knew my way around a function, how that whole thing sort of goes, and I went and looked at it, and I was holy shit, this is something, man. And this is this is 2015 Urbit, and I feel it's very easy to forget. People oh, it doesn't work. There's double rendering issues in the chat messenger. And it was okay, it's important to remember that it used to take 200 milliseconds to register a single keystroke in the dojo.
I remember that.
It's come a long way, right? And so I tried it. I was it's interesting, but I don't know. Hoon seemed too hard to learn, and I didn't. It wasn't very customizable at the time. You could hang out, and obviously, I'm Australian, so I was getting in on Australian time zones, and so it's nobody was there. I got the impression it's a ghost town. It's just vaporwave and abandonware project, products. It's all right, and then so I kind of left it. I ended up finishing high school, doing university for a year, and then dropping out and getting a job at a startup, which it was interesting, because I was initially brought on to do to keep the offshore devs in check, but then I was spending so much of my time keeping said developers in check that they're it would just be easy for you to write this. And so they ended up making me full time.
Yeah.
And I was oh fuck, this is my, I'm a lead developer. I was still 17. And I was I had to there's a big difference between oh, I can code for fun and things like that, and oh, I need to end run the whole productionification of an application, right? There's oh, you can't just save things, you've got to use a database.
Yeah.
And now you have to have a database, and you got to make sure you secure that database, and you got to make sure that your machines are secure, and you've got to have all these VPC rules, and it's by the time I had turned 18, I'd written like 3,000 lines of like CloudFormation, which is like it's like infrastructure as code, like Terraform or whatever, right?
Yeah.
It's like if you have to like doing such a thing to a minor is child abuse, right? Like if you have to like, you have to think about like network interfaces and VPC routing tables at the age of like, it's like this will be, it's barbaric. Yeah. Like this will be looked on in the like 22nd century as like tantamount to like the chimney sweep of the like industrial revolution.
The smoking 4-year-old.
Yeah, exactly. They had them do that? My God. And so like I had like basically like speedrun because of this, and like I was responsible for basically like the entire application. I had speedrun like basically everything that sucks about like the new internet, about like the current internet. Sorry. Yeah. And so I like, I happened to just like start using sort of like Twitter around that time, and like I ended up following Logan actually, and just his tweets just started like intriguing me more. I was like, wait,
tell me
there's
more.
A way out. There's a way out here.
Yeah.
And I remember it because I was like, all right, I'm gonna like get myself an Urbit planet and like have a crack at this again, because I'm like, I need something that's like programming that's like that doesn't like it doesn't give me mild PTSD, right? Yeah. Like I need like
it scratches the same itch.
It scratches that itch, but it's like not like doing war crimes to your own brain. Right?
Yeah.
And so I like started this. I was like, hey, it's not all that hard. Anyway, the company I worked for ended up like launching, and then I quit because I was like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I'm 19 years of age, and I'm like, I'm already done.
Inside you.
Yeah. I'm already like, spiritually a boomer. Like I've just like, no, I can't do this anymore. It's over for me. I'm like, like I wonder if I'm too old to get like a mechanics apprenticeship and start working on cars, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And then I was like, going through like my bookmarks or something at some point in time. And I was like, oh, hey, like Urbit, I remember this. And I was like, just sort of like, oh, Tlon is hiring. And I was like, cool. And then ended up applying there. And then, ended up just sort of like speed running like most of like, straight from like, being Bridge, and we had meetings on like early Bridge. Yeah. And then
I feel like did I hire you? I might have hired you.
Yeah, maybe. I had an interview with Ted and then Galen. And then so I went from like Bridge and then into groups 1 and then into groups 2, and then like after groups 2 I'm like, all right, I know what I need to do.
What
now.
You need to fix.
I know what I need to fix because like everybody wants like, oh, we should just be able to put this bit of this interface inside this other bit.
Yeah. Okay, so what you're working on now, which is give a presentation about, is a new approach to how we build UIs on Urbit. So, most people are used to graphical user interfaces, and we can kind of talk about that predominantly.
Yeah.
So I guess that right now, the best thing to do is just kind of like walk people through, because few people, of course, hopefully do not consider how this works, right? But like, how does a user interface, like let's talk about web for, just to concern ourselves on a website, like on Twitter, just to use that example, unless you have a better one. No. Like, how does that interface go from text file on developer's machine to like in a browser? How's that work?
Right. So the text file on the developer's machine gets fed into a series of transformers, and there's not just one. So you can think of it like a compiler, basically. It's a program that takes code and turns it into a different kind of code, right? And the thing about like the JavaScript ecosystem is there's not just like one kind of these things. It's like an entire like sewerage network of like this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing, and then this thing, right? And so what you actually get out of this is a bunch of like meaningless garbage. Like it's
to a human, certainly.
To a human, yes, right? Like it's all the variables are single letters. It's like all on one line. It looks like, somebody had a stroke at the keyboard.
And this is done for performance reasons, right?
This is done for performance reasons, for like packaging, because the web was never designed to be like this, right? Like it's
designed for like blogs at best.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a grotesque abomination that has just been like, oh, we'll just stick it in there. Yes, exactly. Right. And so like it was never designed to be like this, and so there's just like hacks on top of hacks. It's like much of the same thing that sort of like inspired the quote unquote ball of mud that like Urbit people will often like talk to you at length about.
Yeah.
It's like you can really see it in the way that in which like web applications are like built. And so like once you have this like big, long, disgusting, dyslexia-inducing mess, then you need to host that on a web server somewhere, and somebody goes to twitter.com and it fetches like a description of the page and then like code to make that page interactive.
And that's interpreted by the browser.
That's interpreted by the browser, right? And it's an indictment that like, there are only like 2 browser engines or 3 browser engines really left, because like these things are so hard to build and like so complex as a result of like 20, 30 years of just mud.
Yeah.
That, it takes like a significant like major player in a tech ecosystem to like build one of these things. Like hundreds of engineers.
It's interesting. I was talking to Mopful about lock, just about hardware in general.
Yeah.
Right. And the difference between how many opcodes x86 has, which is zillions,
yes,
and Nock has 12, right?
Right.
And so it's a similar thing where it's like a browser is responsible basically for anything that anyone has ever thrown into the specification, any HTML that's ever been written. A browser has to know how to interpret that, right? So it's like just a lot of cruft at the very least.
Right, and the specification is like just enormous, right? And it's also a not super well defined specification, right? Any person that like makes these apps will tell you, you have to test on Safari, and you have to test on Chrome, and you have to test on Firefox, because like even though they're implementing the same standard, like there is no real standard, because the standard is usually just whatever Chrome does.
Yeah, and this is the downside of, I mean, now people have forgotten that not everything is, not everything used to be a web app, right? But so now the idea is like, Twitter runs mostly in your browser.
Right.
And there are a zillion browsers, or not a zillion, but there's a few browsers, there's a few operating systems.
Right.
And so things can go wrong in all these different places. So from a development point of view, you have to basically get ready that there's going to be someone's using Opera on Linux, and they're going to file a bug because the scroll bar doesn't work.
Somebody is using the like Nintendo 3DS browser to, look at
That's the best. You get a bug. You get a bug, and then at the very end, you see what they're trying to do it on, and you're like, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" Yeah, it's like a Kindle reader.
My Samsung fridge, like
exactly. Okay, so this is kind of like the workflow now, and we kind of started at the text file, but also just explain to people like what HTML, CSS, and JavaScript basically are. Like what goes into that text file?
So HTML is like originally started out as a method of like a self-describing document, right? It's like it defines its own like layout, and it defines like a hierarchy of things such that you could have this like rich text. You could have
mostly for text, right?
Right.
So
it's mostly for text.
Here's
like,
the title. Here's the subheader.
It originates like overwhelmingly as like a document format, not as an application format, right? And then, we had some years of just HTML. And then somebody has the bright idea of introducing like, hey, we should be able to like style these things. And it was a great idea at the time. You should be able to style these things. And then so CSS came into being. And so this is a like language for describing like, hey, any sort of object that matches these criteria should have this style applied to it. And it was a good idea at the time, right? And under the like constraints of like what HTML was.
Yeah.
And then so a couple of years again down the track, we have this, JavaScript, right? Some famously written in like a week. JavaScript was like, hey, you should be able to like programmatically, like via code that runs on the user's computer, you should be able to programmatically, change the document, right? And then, this is nice if you want like just a slightly interactive document. And of course, as tech people do, somebody takes this way too far.
Yeah.
Right? It's like
Google Maps was not envisioned in
No,
yeah.
Absolutely not. And so like, and then the real breakthrough was when XML HTTP request was created, which meant that you basically could ask in JavaScript to go fetch some code from somewhere else.
Yeah.
And so this ushers in this new thing of like, oh, we have this like cybernetic assemblage of this like rapidly self-modifying document that behaves as an application, but is really nothing, no such thing.
Yeah. So it's like, I mean, it's interesting to think about, like, just to confine ourselves to Twitter, right? It's like the infinite scroll, right? It's like every time you scroll down, something is going in the background and getting more tweets and injecting it into the page.
Right. And it's like, it's a treadmill, right? This whole idea of like an infinite scroll is an illusion that they feed to you. They're pulling the wool over your eyes.
The infinite scroll is not real.
Yeah, it's not real. Like, and so like they have, and the thing is like infinite scroll is like just straight up bad for you.
Yeah, no, I agree.
And so like
considered harmful.
You have no like defense against this, right? If that's the way, because you can't modify the code. Like you don't know what it means. Like, and the only way to access Twitter,
if Elon says there's infinite scroll,
you get infinite scroll, dude. Like what he says goes. Yeah. Right.
And so I mean it's interesting, just like you think about all the, I never thought about this sort of like aesthetic moral implications, right? But almost all the things that one would say, oh, this is bad, even just normal ads or infinite scroll, this stuff is like, it's all because of JavaScript.
It's because of JavaScript, right?
Because you can just insert an ad into the feed. You can, and which is not really part of the original specification.
Right, and there's no good way to like, well, I mean, obviously we have ad block, but like a more deeper change, like, turning infinite scroll into like a page, like forum style, like page 1, page 2, page 3.
Yeah.
Like that's just like beyond like a reasonable task.
Yeah.
Right.
And so just even that, confine yourself to that use case, that's a great like Urbit comprehensible thing, right? Because you are using a UI that is served centrally, and just even I'm sure I don't want to impugn the motives of Elon Musk, but it's like even if he was like
we
trying,
we can impugn his motives. He's like basically like another icon at this point, right?
That is true. So, but it's like, if you have a centrally served UI, everyone has to have the same UI. Yes. So maybe you like infinite scroll, I don't, but we still have to have the same UI just because the sort of like topography of how it's
And this is how you get like the industrialization of design of this, like everything must be designed for like the lowest common denominator of these like, big buttons with like, like a tap area that you could like drive a truck through, right?
Yes, exactly. Well, people like big buttons.
People love big buttons. Like old people like big buttons, basically, right? But like I have a working set of eyes. I don't need big buttons. I would much rather read more tweets at like once.
Absolutely. Right? So kind of that's an overview of how something obviously centralized like Twitter is architected and kind of like implemented from a UI standpoint. So right now, how is a UI implemented on Urbit? Like, how is groups implemented? Does it differ significantly from this?
And so what's really tragic is that it doesn't. It doesn't. Right.
Okay.
So it's like we use basically the same tools and the same infrastructure that with some certain concessions towards, Urbit behaves slightly differently to your like classic server backend. But it is more or less like exactly the evil thing that we don't like. Yeah. Right. And
on the front end side.
Yes, on the front end side. Right. And this is like, to me at least, this is like the original sin of Urbit. Like we fixed almost everything except the front ends.
Yeah. And so it's like you have this whole way of building UIs, like in the Twitter example, that is for a centralized UI. It's for millions of users going to the same website. Yes. And, just in case people aren't familiar, it's like the Urbit usage pattern is basically you're the only person going to your ships. So it's like literally a website with one user, maybe, a few more in a different usage pattern, but predominantly one user. True. Yet you use the same models from the centralized, because that doesn't actually make that much sense when you think about it.
It doesn't make any sense, right? And it's... and another part of this is that like, you could write like another like JavaScript client for like say landscape, right? And do that because, the code is all open source and so on and so forth. But it's such a huge task, right? To like, replace like the landscape, like front end is like, 4 to 5, maybe even 6 developer years of like work.
Yeah.
And like, nobody...
Asking someone to go do your own is that's unreasonable.
This is like impossible, like unreasonable task.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, it's interesting to think, it's like the whole, one of the main insights behind making this simple backend of Urbit, right, of Arbo,
Yeah.
is that you would be able to make the front end simpler.
Yes.
Right? Because if it's not simple from the user's point of view, then it's not simple,
It's
right?
not simple, exactly.
And so it's sort of like we haven't gotten there yet, right?
We haven't gotten
so it's sort of like if you, and you know, I think you're right, is if it's not configurable on the part of the user, then it's not configurable.
Right. It doesn't serve the user, right? And this is what computers are for and what everybody has lost track of.
Yeah.
Like everyone's becoming enslaved to this whole like, you know, the like cybernetic god of control that like, you know, the big tech companies represent.
Yeah.
And like this is evil and like wrong and like
the computer was invented for man and not man for the computer.
Exactly, right?
As it says in the Bible.
As it says in the Bible.
But no, absolutely. So okay, so a lot of your proposal and what you've been working on for the last months or so is okay, that sounds great, but like, you know, now do it, right? So
exactly.
So how are we going to do it? What do you propose to do? Kind of just give us the top level and I'll ask more questions to clarify.
The top level is like basically this, is that interfaces are not actually all that complex pieces of software. Like they are complex for a variety of incidental reasons, but none of that is like essential to like, it's not like contingent on the like idea of an interface itself. Yeah. And so like, and the reason these incidental reasons are actually like largely like profit motive driven reasons. And like, you know, the reason we have so much autism over the way things look is because, you know, we have these PR wonks at these big tech companies being like, oh, it must like reflect the corporate brand. I'm like, I don't want a fucking corporate brand in my house when I'm just trying to like look at things. You know, no.
Get your brand out of my computer.
Get your brand out of my goddamn house.
Yeah.
And so like, that is like
so part of that, the initial part, like I think it's a good point, is just like separating like what is the intrinsic complexity of a UI, what needs to be complex, and what is sort of like related to this other stuff, like just the business models of the and like style things of this, like what can be shorn off.
And in my opinion, like the essential complexity is actually close to zero. It's like you need some way to output things in a structured manner, right? So you need like structured output that allows you to like allows the user to see the like relationships of data to like other data, right? And so you need some like structured output, but it's like that's just like you have like
a list of
like you have like a tree and there's good values in the tree, like that's it, right?
Yeah.
And then so the other thing you need is like some kind of like input, right? Like input output that computer is doing something. You know, that is an interface. That is the
you press the button and something happens,
right? And so like turns out like, you know, input is not all that hard either, right? Because you have like, well, if you're like rendering a thing to screen, if you're like taking a piece of data and you're putting it on the screen, then more than likely you also need to edit that, right?
Yeah.
So we can just say that like, oh, okay, so all an interface is a selection of data, some of which, you know, might be editable.
Yeah.
Right. And then so, you know, you want buttons to like, you know, make, you know, to like save your changes and like other stuff. It's like once you have buttons, inputs, and like, you know, the rendering of like the rendering of data. And you also want a fourth thing, which is like copy, like instructions on like how to use things, that like, you know, people can like
just
anchor
display,
themselves like in like whether, so where am I in the UI? And you do a bunch of reading and you can work out where you are. But once you have like copy, data, inputs, buttons, that's it.
Yeah.
That's all you need.
And everything is some combination or different visual presentation of that.
Combination, right? And so that's basically like, you know, the, you know, dummies version of what like the interface proposal that I'm writing is.
Yeah. So what that looks like concretely is a data structure that represents that in a way that then there are front end things that can interpret that. Is that correct? So explain and that we call that a renderer, right?
We call that a renderer.
And so explain kind of what a renderer would look like then.
Okay, and so we have this like, you know, nice, very simple tree. Like it's almost so simple that you could Kelvin version it, right? You'd be like, okay, this is it. This is the way we describe interfaces until the rest
do Twitter. Just explain kind of like what a Twitter's data structure would look like.
Right, and so like Twitter's data structure looks like,
the UI data structure.
Right, it looks like a series of like headings, and you have like some click handlers on those like headings to like be like, okay, I want to go to home, I want to go to notifications, I want to go to DMs, right? So you have these three things. And then you just have a list, and then each element in that list is a tweet.
Yeah.
And so because it's a tree, you can just put things inside the things. So you have like a list, and then inside that list is a list of tweets.
Yeah.
Shocker. And so you have each tweet, and each tweet is like, okay, so we have this tweet, and it's like identified by its ID or whatever. And so we have the content of the tweet, and then we have like, the author of the tweet, and we have like so on and so forth.
Likes and just stuff, and like, which is just a data representation.
And so like how this differs from like HTML, which I think is like important. This is like
this is close to original HTML.
Yes,
it's almost very, very
superficially similar. And like how this like differs is that because we actually don't allow for any kind of developer provided styling, like the tree is free to be the way sort of HTML1 was intended to be, which is that like it's a semantic map of like, okay, this is the sort of way in which you should relate to the thing. And so we have this like this Twitter datum and like this whole the data structure that describes this interface. And so okay, that's great, and it's all fine and dandy. We've done our like platonic ideal of an interface, like theory selling.
It's like reading the script to a movie at the very best, right? It's like, well, where's the movie?
It's like now you have to like acquire like assistant cameras and like deal with like lighting and all the stuff that makes a movie kino instead of just words on a page. Right. And so this is like obviously it's like slightly cheap thinking, because I've just like, all the complexity that you thought was in the like that we've pulled out, we're just going to dump in the renderer. And this is actually a reasonable thing to do. Yeah. Because the renderer is the renderer author and the renderer's user's issue. Yeah. Right? It's not everybody who has written like an interface. That's not their issue, right? Yeah. And so dumping all of this like complexity into the renderer makes like a lot of sense.
Yeah, 100%.
Because, it can adapt to like certain particularities of the way like the device that it is running on, for instance, right? Like you want to render a phone app like very differently to the way you render a like desktop app, right? Because you just fundamentally have different you can tap on a thing, there's like swipes and all that kind of shit. Yeah. And so like with like this sort of renderer model is like the renderer is free to do that. Mm-hmm. It's free to treat like as long as it can present something to the user that the user can understand, it's free to do whatever it likes. Yeah. Right. And this is, I think, the real like power of the thing is because, because it's like it makes it legible and like manipulable in a way that's like your interface becomes a tool instead of something like not even a tool, but like something higher than a
like
tool.
Like a lens or something.
Yeah, like a tool that can be modified in like a meaningful way, right? Yeah. It's like a good socket set, right? Yeah. Like you can...
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting way to put it. Because I mean, I was thinking about, we say, okay, there's Twitter, there's the Twitter, the platonic Twitter. Yes. And then you want to see it one way, I want to see it another way. I like big ass, I'm old, I want big ass buttons, and you want the sort of tight text and mono spot. Yeah. And that can be defined at the renderer level on each of our ships. Yes. Right. But that still means that someone who's shipping that application can just have a clean representation that we share. Yes, right. We share, and so the renderer can be ship dependent, just even on that basic level.
Yes, the render can be like ship dependently, and like it's also like worth mentioning that this is not just like a purely like stylistic thing of like margins or colors or whatever. Like it could be like entirely sort of new interaction models of like, oh, I have like, I want like a really regular, like almost like a file browser, navigation style, or I want something that's like really pretty and that like, uses like some like fantastical like design thinking to like really, really make it pop. Yeah. Like some people like really give a shit about like a design just like popping. Yeah. Like other people don't. Yeah. Right.
Well, I mean, it's like, trivial example. I mean, it could be layout as well. Right. And so it's like, you can imagine something where it's like you see your tweets in a linear list and I see mine in a grid format, and how what happens when you click the button can be different. It can be much deeper than just like the color of the titles or something.
Yes, absolutely,
which it can be
right.
well.
Like, there's a real opportunity to like make like legible and coherent to the end user, like this idea of like it's your interface,
Yes,
and like you can do like it should look how you want it to, right?
Yeah.
And you have this optionality of using any renderer you want that produces like results that you like.
Yeah, 100%. And you can imagine, I mean, it's interesting to think that, you could then have, marketplace, whatever. You could have like an app store, not only for back-end apps, but also for different renderings on the same app, right? So
absolutely, right.
like Tumblr themes, but like times
Tumblr themes. But imagine if like your entire computer like took on like this Tumblr thing.
Yeah. I shudder to think, but I think everyone, should have the freedom to have a totally disgusting layout of their. If someone wants like green background and blue text, like God bless.
I support like the freedom to Comic Sans,
exactly,
but also the freedom from Comic Sans.
Exactly. Defend your right. Defend my life. Your right to Comic Sans. Okay, that's good. So I think that I understand. I think I see sort of a little bit more of the vision now. So from your perspective, like what would this enable for like developer? Like, how would this change the life of an Urbit developer?
Okay, and so
revolutionize their life.
Well, it's going to. Like,
how is it going to revolutionize their life?
Yeah, I've got some statistics for you. We're going to have like 70% like better quality of life.
Absolutely,
like
72%.
And so, well, the real like benefits are basically in like developer experience, because all the heavy lifting is done once by the renderer. You can build apps incredibly quickly.
Yeah.
And so you don't need to go and replace, right? Like, and re-implement. Like the number of times like a drop-down menu has been re-implemented on HTML exceeds the number of atoms in the universe.
Yes. Yeah.
And like, because it's just like, you're just like putting data in there and the renderer has to deal with that, you don't have to do all this like stupid custom like logic, right? It's like, if you have like a really nice renderer, right? And like this application in the interface is asking for like a video input, right? If you have like a nice renderer, it might pull up like Final Cut Pro, right?
Yeah.
And then like you've got like a full nonlinear editor like in that like right in your application, right? And that nonlinear editor happens wherever there is a video input, right?
Yeah.
So there's no need for like each developer to go and like hand ring over their own like thing. It's like, no, you just put a video input in there and it's just there.
That's interesting. That's really interesting.
And so you get better polish for less work.
Yeah.
Right. And this is like, and the reason this like exists is because HTML like was only intended as a document like standard. And so like it has no native support for like, well, it has drop down menus, but it only got those like a year or two ago.
Yeah.
Like a year or two ago, like we've been doing drop down menus since 2006, man.
Yeah. So I was thinking also that, one thing from the developer's point of view as well is like, as it is now, you kind of have this parallax experience where you develop the back end and then you develop the front end.
Yeah.
And you're kind of switching between these two things. Yeah. And this would allow you to basically just kind of keep it in one context, which certainly is more is better.
Right. You don't have to like, so Hoon speaks like an Urbit, uses a data type called a noun, and nouns are very like central to the idea of Urbit, right? Urbit is almost like the noun processing computer, right?
Yeah.
And so, in order to work with this in a browser environment, you need to convert this to some other object format. And like that format does not actually play super nicely with things. So you have like a bunch of friction there.
Yeah.
And so like just having all of your code just like in the one language, like in the one sort of like plane of consistency, like, it's not some like retarded like David Lynch movie where you're like switching between like different like narrators' perspectives, all the fucking. That's what it feels like to do full stack, right?
Yeah,
you're like, oh, I'm suddenly in like Hoon world. Everything is like at right angles and extremely regular, and like now I'm in JavaScript world, and it's this like Lovecraftian swamp that you're like just wading through in like thigh high like gumboots.
So it's interesting because like of course, people complain. Hoon devs complain about JavaScript is a tale basically as old as time. And
absolutely.
Sometimes people will be like, we'll sack up,
Yeah.
But I mean, it is, I think, relatively objective that context switching is costly, right? It's like, it's a value neutral statement. It's like the more you have to switch context, the more friction there is and so forth.
Absolutely.
So if you can reduce that, it just seems like obviously better for productivity.
Right. And there's, obviously like the code reuse stuff, but there's also things like, an overwhelming amount of time is spent in JavaScript land, like fetching data and because what you have to do to make a performant modern web app is to basically like replicate like a view onto the data you have on the front end.
Yeah.
So you end up actually implementing your app twice, once on the front end and once on the back end. Right? It needs to know how to understand how to add a comment to a post when it sees a new comment, right?
Yeah, and it should be pointed out that like the renderers that could be written almost certainly will have JavaScript in them, and thus, I mean, a lot of them will, and so. You're not giving up all the performance optimization that has gone into JavaScript, which is significant. It's like these browsers were meant to run modern JavaScript. So it's like, we're not saying you need to necessarily go back and reinvent any rendering system. It can use the stuff that already exists.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely. And so you get more, because there's like less code to write, more features per unit time, less context switching, less context switching, again, more features per unit time.
Yeah.
And so ideally, like what I want to see is like for us to go back to the world of like single person like dev teams, right?
Yeah.
Because like a single person has like, there are advantages to being a single person.
Artisan.
An artisan, right? Like a code craftsman.
Exactly.
Right? And like this has like implications about like the way product is done, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like this like incomplete vision that's being relayed over like lossy mediums such as English.
Yeah.
To like, inculculate the minds of the developers in this like mass brainwashing scheme so that they can then like, carry out the like work of their like product manager / demiurge. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, get like auteur computing, like auteur programming is like something that like I think this enables.
Yeah.
Right. Because
and that would change the landscape of a lot of things, actually.
Fundamentally the landscape.
Not just like the actual interface, but the organization of the companies or cells or teams that are doing it, right? Right.
It's like, I forget which law it is, but it's like often quoted aphorism to come out of like Amazon or whatever. It's like the architecture of your application like is a product of the like architecture of your team.
Yeah.
It's like you don't have a team. Yeah. You don't have to have any architecture. You don't need to think. It just exists.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so like it also like in doing this, like you're driving down Urbit already has like such crazy like DevX because there's no dicking around with databases, there's no operational costs, so on and so forth. Like you kind of see the end run of Urbit, which is like driving down the like marginal cost of software to zero.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so like when we have that, then like there's so much like in ways that like people don't understand like how computers, like how they could use computers.
Yeah.
Because, I have this like very specific need for software that only 10 other people like need.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, go find those 10 other people, get them all to chip in $100 and you can pay a Hoon dev to write it in 2 days.
Yeah.
Done.
Yeah,
and you have this like, and there's no maintenance cost or anything like that. And so like, it's just like a fundamentally different world in which computers can really like, computers can serve people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
And I think it's probably underestimated by people who haven't done this crap a lot. It's that like, you think about the bad things about whatever complaint one has about Web 2, the internet, whatever. Everyone's got some complaint.
Yeah.
And a lot of them sort of like, it's like profit motive and this kind of stuff. But a lot of it actually has to do with this kind of stuff. Like the kinds of manpower necessary to implement a user interface, which is most of an app for most people, right? It really is, you know? And so the more people it requires, the more bureaucracy it requires. And it's sort of like, it all stems to that. So you actually can enable it just through this.
It's like, it's the industrialization of software. You know what I mean? Instead of like, in like where it was once in the 70s where you have like, like small like tinkerers, like, writing like fucking Prince of Persia or whatever. It's like one guy, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's almost very similar to like, the Industrial Revolution, like changing our relationship with food, right?
Yeah.
You used to go from these like organic, like, just somebody like making bread to this like enormous industrialization of like the only way you can profitably make bread is to like cook it up in like enormous vats and add like sugars to it and like weird toxins and like starch and yeast and all this kind of shit, and just to eke out extra cents, right?
That's
and
a really good point. Yeah.
And so it's like, the joke is often made like Urbit is like Amish or like Mormon computing, but it is in a general real sense because like this like it's like a deindustrialization of computing in the same way that like the Amish are attempting to do it, like a deindustrialization of the like food supply.
Yeah, yeah.
And like that, I think like there's like a lot of I don't necessarily.
There's a grain of truth there.
There's a grain of truth there, right? And there's like I don't necessarily agree 100% with what the Amish do, but like it works for people. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it always helps to like step back every once in a while and be like, is this technology serving whatever higher purpose we're trying to achieve with it, as opposed to just kind of like getting your hand stuck in the machine and just going along with it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just how I think about it. All right, well, that's great. I mean, I think we covered everything I was interested to know here. Yeah. In terms of following your work, where can people find you on Urbit and on the ClearNet? Like
Okay, so I'm hastuc-dibtux. It's HASTUC.
I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, PT. Yep. And then I have a Twitter account on this. It's the same as my PatP. And I intend to start a group at some point to detail. I've been, building in private. Don't shout at me.
Okay.
Building in private just to like kind of, like concretize my like notions of what exactly this project is.
Yeah.
And like, I think I'm hoping to have a demo ready so other people say, when is this coming
out? It'll be a couple weeks.
Okay. So like probably by the time that you're listening to this, that like you'll be able to install it and, I'll check my Twitter. It'll probably be the pinned tweet or something.
Very cool. Okay. Well, thank you so much, man.
Yeah.
Great talking.
Worries.
Boom.